Deep in the sweltering, claustrophobic heart of a classified training facility in Southeast Asia, a silence hung in the air that was heavier than the humidity itself. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the terrifying, suffocating quiet of an invisible predator waiting to strike. Just hours earlier, one of Europe's most elite special forces commanders had stood in an air-conditioned tactical operations center, laughing at the primitive diagrams of bamboo traps and noise decoys presented by his hosts. He had called them museum relics and cute tricks that would never work against modern thermal optics and satellite tracking. Now, that same commander lay face down in the mud, his high-tech communications gear buzzing with static, his entire squad neutralized without a single shot being fired from a rifle. What unfolded in those intervening hours didn't just bruise an ego. It shattered a decades-old military doctrine and forced the world's most advanced armies to rethink everything they knew about jungle warfare. This is the story of the exercise that was never supposed to be public, a clash of ideologies that proved technology has a breaking point, and the moment a masterclass in guerrilla warfare humbled the best of the best. To understand the magnitude of this event, we have to look at the players involved and the massive disparity in their resources. On one side, you had a detachment from Germany's top-tier Special Operations Unit, a group renowned for their precision, discipline, and reliance on cutting-edge military engineering. They arrived in the Philippines looking like soldiers from the future, equipped with the latest night vision panoramas, drone swarms capable of mapping terrain in real time, and biometric sensors that could detect a heartbeat through a concrete wall. They were the apex of NATO standard operating procedures, trained to dominate the battlefield through superior firepower and information supremacy. Their objective was simple: navigate a 10-kilometer stretch of dense rainforest to capture a high-value target. They viewed the terrain as an obstacle to be overcome with force and calculation, a variable that could be solved with mathematics and machinery. Their confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was built on a track record of victories in deserts and urban centers across the globe. Opposing them was a select group of the Philippine Scout Rangers and local guerrilla warfare instructors, men who didn't look like they belonged on the same battlefield as their European counterparts. They wore mismatched, faded fatigues and carried equipment that looked like it had seen service in 3 different decades. There were no drones buzzing over their heads, no complex heads-up displays, and their tactical center was often nothing more than a circle of dirt where they drew plans with a stick. When the German commander, a decorated veteran named Colonel Richter, first inspected the Filipino loadout, he openly questioned the utility of carrying machetes and simple rope in the age of digital warfare. He remarked to his aide that this exercise would be a walk in the park, a mere formality to cement diplomatic ties rather than a genuine test of their capabilities. He didn't understand that the Filipinos weren't preparing to fight the German soldiers directly. They were preparing to weaponize the jungle itself, turning the environment into an overwhelming ally that no amount of technology could hack or jam. The exercise, codenamed Iron Canopy, began at 0400 hours under the cover of a pitch-black, moonless sky. The insertion phase seemed to validate Colonel Richter's confidence immediately. The German team moved with mechanical efficiency, their night vision goggles turning the oppressive darkness into a clear, green-tinted landscape. They communicated via encrypted, silent comms, moving in a perfect wedge formation that covered all angles. Within the first hour, they had covered 3 kilometers, slicing through the outer perimeter of the jungle with the speed of an urban assault team. Their drones buzzed ahead, scanning for heat signatures, assuring them that the path ahead was clear. To the observers back at base monitoring the GPS trackers, it looked like a rout was inevitable. The German unit was simply moving too fast and too precisely for the low-tech opposition to organize a coherent defense. But the Filipino guerrillas weren't trying to block them. They were baiting them deeper, inviting them into the kill box where the rules of engagement would shift dramatically. As the sun began to rise, the jungle woke up, and the German unit's technological advantage began to erode in ways they hadn't anticipated. The temperature spiked to 35 degrees Celsius with 90% humidity, creating a thick mist that confused their thermal sensors. The dense canopy, comprised of triple-layered vegetation, scattered the signals of their aerial drones, rendering them erratic and unreliable. The heavy, waterlogged air began to sap the endurance of the European soldiers, who were weighed down by 40 kilograms of batteries, armor, and ammunition. It was here, around the halfway mark, that the psychological warfare began. It started innocuously, a snapped twig to the left, a rustle of leaves to the right. The German point man would freeze, scan the area with his advanced optics, and see nothing but ferns and trees. They were chasing ghosts. The Filipinos were using the natural acoustics of the jungle, throwing sounds and using animal mimicry to force the Germans to stop, scan, and hesitate every few hundred meters, draining their mental energy and slowing their momentum to a crawl. By noon, the walk in the park had turned into a grueling slog through mud that seemed to have a will of its own. The pristine German formation had broken down into a single file line as the terrain became impassable for a wedge. This was exactly what the Filipino commander, a quiet man named Sergeant Tupas, had been waiting for. Tupas knew that in the jungle, straight lines were death traps. He had positioned his men not in foxholes or bunkers, but up in the canopy and buried beneath the root systems of massive bolete trees. They were camouflaged not just visually, but thermally, having covered themselves in cool mud and wet foliage to blend in with the ambient temperature of the forest floor. The German sensors, looking for the sharp contrast of body heat, swept right over them. Colonel Richter, growing frustrated with the delay and the oppressive heat, ordered his men to push the pace, ignoring the subtle warning signs that the environment was changing around them. The first contact wasn't a firefight. It was a humiliation. The German rear guard, a soldier tasked with watching their six, suddenly found himself hoisted 3 meters into the air. He hadn't stepped on a landmine. He had triggered a simple, gravity-powered snare hidden beneath a layer of rotting leaves. It was a non-lethal trap, designed to capture rather than kill, constructed from braided vines and a bent sapling. As the soldier dangled there, shouting for assistance, the rest of the unit scrambled to set up a defensive perimeter, expecting an ambush. But no shots came. Instead, a terrifying sound echoed through the trees, the sound of bamboo clacking together, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a distraction technique used by guerrillas for generations. While the Germans pointed their rifles outward, scanning for targets, the Filipinos silently moved in closer, using the noise to mask their footsteps. The high-tech comms gear was filled with the panicked breathing of the trapped soldier, breaking the unit's disciplined silence. Colonel Richter realized too late that his unit had been herded into a prepared zone. He tried to call in a drone for air support to spot the attackers, but the thick canopy blocked the signal. He checked his GPS, but the signal was bouncing off the canyon walls, giving him false coordinates. They were effectively blind and deaf. He ordered a retreat to a defensible clearing they had passed a kilometer back, but as they turned, they realized the path they had just cut was gone. The Filipinos had used a technique of closing the door, manually bending branches and moving foliage back into place immediately after the enemy passed, erasing the trail and disorienting anyone trying to backtrack. The jungle looked identical in every direction. Panic, a rare emotion for such elite operators, began to set in. The sleek efficiency of the German war machine was grinding to a halt against the organic, chaotic reality of the environment. The dismantling of the unit continued systematically, and it was devoid of the shock and/or firepower the West was used to. The next 2 soldiers were taken out by punji stick simulations, rubber-tipped stakes hidden in tall grass that, in a real war, would have pierced boots and crippled legs. The umpires of the exercise, monitoring the situation, declared the men casualties. Now down 3 men and carrying wounded, the German unit's mobility was cut in half. They were exhausted, overheated, and fighting an enemy they still hadn't seen. Colonel Richter tried to rally his men, relying on standard counter-ambush drills, unleashing suppressing fire into the tree line where he thought the enemy was. Thousands of rounds of ammo shredded the vegetation, decimating the flora. When the firing stopped, the silence returned instantly. They had wasted precious ammo shooting at leaves. The Filipinos hadn't been there for 10 minutes. As afternoon turned to dusk, the coup de grace was delivered. The German unit, now huddled in a defensive circle, exhausted and low on water, prepared for a final stand. They activated their night vision early, desperate for any advantage. Suddenly, flares erupted all around them, not military-grade flares, but improvised bamboo tubes packed with slow-burning sap and magnesium shavings. The intense, Flickering light washed out their night vision goggles, blinding them with white-hot glare. They had to rip the expensive optics off their faces to see anything. In that moment of transition, while their eyes struggled to adjust to the natural light, the scout rangers struck. They didn't shoot. They simply dropped from the trees and rose from the mud within the German perimeter. Before Colonel Richter could even raise his sidearm, he felt the cold steel of a dummy knife against his neck. "Bang!" whispered Sergeant Tupas, the Filipino team leader, directly into the colonel's ear. Around them, every single German operator had a Filipino guerrilla standing over them or behind them. The ambush had been absolute. The entire German unit had been wiped out without the Filipino team firing a single live round or suffering a single casualty. The exercise was called to a halt. The lights of the facility were turned on, illuminating the scene. The contrast was striking. The German soldiers, covered in high-tech gear, were gasping for air, covered in sweat and mud, looking defeated. The Filipino soldiers, holding nothing but old rifles and machetes, looked as fresh as they had at the start, breathing easy, seemingly part of the forest itself. The dismissal of primitive methods had resulted in a total tactical failure for one of the world's most advanced military units. The debriefing that followed was uncomfortable, intense, and ultimately transformative. Colonel Richter, to his credit, didn't make excuses. He stood before the Joint Chiefs and the exercise umpires, still covered in the mud of the jungle, and admitted that his reliance on technology had been his downfall. He explained how every piece of gear they had brought became a liability. The heavy armor caused heat exhaustion, the complex optics tunnel-visioned their awareness, the reliance on comms made them lazy in their verbal and non-verbal coordination. He pointed to the bamboo trap that had snared his rear guard and held it up, not as a joke, but as a masterpiece of engineering. "We spent millions on sensors to find the enemy," he told the room, "and they defeated us with a vine that cost nothing. We were looking at screens, they were looking at the world." The Filipino tactics were dissected and analyzed with a newfound reverence. The analysts broke down how the guerrillas used the concept of flow rather than force. They didn't try to hack the jungle, they moved with it. They utilized passive intelligence, birds stopping their calls, the direction of the wind carrying scent, the texture of the mud indicating recent disturbance. These were data points that no computer could process as fast as a human instinct honed by years of survival. The primitive traps were revealed to be psychological weapons. Their purpose wasn't just to injure, but to instill a paralyzing fear in the enemy, making them question every step, slowing their advance to a pace where they could be easily flanked. The Germans realized that they had prepared for a shooting war, while the Filipinos were waging a war of the mind and the environment. Word of the Iron Canopy exercise spread quietly through the global Special Forces community. It became a case study in military academies from West Point to Sandhurst. The narrative of the invincible tech soldier was cracked. It forced a shift in training doctrine. High-tech units began incorporating primitive survival weeks into their courses, stripping soldiers of their GPS and night vision and forcing them to navigate using stars, maps, and intuition. The respect for the Filipino Scout Rangers skyrocketed. They were no longer seen as an under-equipped regional force, but as the premier experts in jungle warfare, sought after as instructors by the very nations that had once looked down on them. They had proven that in the specific context of their environment, a machete in the right hand was deadlier than a smart missile. But the most profound change happened within Colonel Richter himself. Years later, in a memoir, he wrote about that day in the Philippine jungle as the most important defeat of his career. He described the moment Sergeant Tupas whispered "bang" in his ear not as an insult, but as a gift. It was a reminder that war is ultimately a human endeavor, decided by grit, creativity, and the ability to endure, not just by who has the biggest budget or the fastest processor. He maintained a correspondence with Sergeant Tupas, and they eventually conducted joint training seminars together, bridging the gap between the old ways and the new. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the humble understanding that true mastery lies in adaptability. The story highlights a universal truth that goes beyond military strategy. Over-reliance on tools can dull the user's skill. We live in an age where we assume there is an app, a device, or a system for everything. We trust the GPS so much we forget how to read a map. We trust the algorithm so much we forget how to choose. We trust the machine so much we forget the power of human intuition. The German Commandos fell into the trap of thinking their equipment made them superior, forgetting that equipment is only as good as the soldier using it, and that nature has a way of humbling even the most expensive machinery. The primitive methods were actually highly sophisticated adaptations to a specific reality, refined over centuries of defending a homeland. In the end, the shock that the world felt wasn't just about a lost training exercise. It was the shock of recognizing that money doesn't always buy victory. It was the realization that the human spirit, when allied with its environment and fueled by ingenuity, is a formidable force that can topple giants. The image of the high-tech soldier hanging helplessly from a vine while a silent warrior watches from the shadows is a potent symbol. It serves as a warning against hubris and a testament to the enduring power of asymmetrical warfare. The Filipino guerrillas didn't win because they had better guns. They won because they had better eyes, better ears, and a deeper connection to the battlefield. The legacy of that day continues to influence how modern wars are fought in dense terrain. We see echoes of it in current conflicts where smaller, mobile forces use commercial drones and improvised devices to stall massive armored columns. The lesson of Iron Canopy is that you cannot simply buy your way out of a problem. You have to think your way through it. The bamboo trap, the noise decoy, the mud camouflage, these weren't signs of poverty, they were signs of brilliance. They were efficient, sustainable, and terrifyingly effective. The Germans learned that lesson the hard way, but thanks to them, the rest of the world got a glimpse into the terrifying efficiency of the Filipino jungle fighter. So, the next time you see a display of overwhelming military might, all chrome and digital precision, remember the story of Colonel Richter and Sergeant Tupas. Remember that in the dark, wet chaos of the real world, the batteries eventually die, the lenses fog up, and the satellite signal fades. And when the screen goes black, all that is left is the soldier and the wild. And in that darkness, the one who knows the land, the one who respects the silence, and the one who can turn a twig into a weapon, is the one who will be left standing. The world was shocked because they had forgotten the basics. The Filipinos never had. This encounter stands as a timeless reminder that respect should never be measured by the price tag of one's equipment. It validates the idea that local knowledge surpasses imported theory. It proved that the warrior mindset, the ability to adapt, to endure, and to outthink, is the ultimate weapon system. The German Commandos left the Philippines with bruised egos but sharper minds, carrying a lesson that would save their lives in future deployments. And the Filipino Scout Rangers faded back into the jungle, the quiet guardians of a deadly art form, ready to teach the next lesson to anyone foolish enough to underestimate the power of the primitive. 21. Ultimately, this story isn't just about soldiers. It's about the clash between the artificial and the natural, the complex and the simple. It challenges us to look at our own lives and ask where we might be overcomplicating things, where we might be relying on a high-tech solution when a bamboo solution would work better. It's a story of humility, of the devastating effectiveness of simplicity, and of the enduring truth that underdogs are only underdogs until the environment changes. The German Commandos dismissed the guerrilla methods, and in doing so, they walked right into a masterclass that the world would never forget.